So, Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl is one of those games that promises a lot, and in many ways, it absolutely delivers. It's got an immersive world, tense atmosphere, and a unique take on the survival setting, but like many ambitious games, it's not without its flaws. And I'm not just talking about the obvious bugs and performance problems.
Cover me, brothers! I'm hit!
And while these issues don't necessarily ruin the experience, sometimes I couldn't help but feel that there's an even better game hiding beneath the surface. So as of writing this, the state of the game is still evolving. Several updates and patches have already been released since I started making this, proving that the devs are listening and keeping on top of it. However, not all of my gripes have vanished. So first, what is it? Stalker 2 is an open world survival FPS that's all about atmospheric tension, player-driven exploration, and hardcore mechanics. This isn't your typical shoot and loot experience. The survival is brutal, ammo is scarce, or it's supposed to be, and every decision feels like it could be your last. The game leans heavily into immersion with dynamic AI systems, a gritty narrative, and a world that feels alive and hostile in equal measure. You can crudely think of it as an open world Metro in terms of gameplay. If you're a fan of intense atmospheric shooters where every bullet counts, Stalker 2 will be right up your alley. It's perfect for players who enjoy games that don't hold their hand, and where exploration is rewarded but the cost of curiosity can be steep. It's not a game for everyone, and that's fine because I don't think it was made to be. So I should preface what's coming by admitting I've never played the earlier Stalker games, but even without the experience, it's clear that GSC really understands their audience and what they're looking for. This isn't a game trying to cater to everyone or chase trendy tropes. It knows exactly what it wants to be. Take the atmosphere, for example. It's pretty spot on. Delving into the zone is tense and thrilling, with rustling trees, howling winds, and the distant rumble of storms. And man, the storms, probably the best I've seen in any game to date. And all of this combines to pull you deep into the immersion of the zone. Though that said, one thing that irks me is the random howls or mutant noises that you hear off in the distance. Early on, those sounds kept me on edge, constantly watching my back, thinking that I needed to be cautious about what might be lurking nearby. But after a while, I realised that those noises are purely atmospheric. They don't actually signify any threats. Which, once you realise this, it kind of defeats the purpose of having them. And it's disappointing because those sounds could have added so much to the tension if they were actually tied to something real. And while this is a relatively minor gripe, it's also a bit of a recurring theme in the game, which you'll see. So to talk of visuals, Stalker 2 does deserve some praise here. It's not the kind of game that wows you with vibrant, picturesque vistas begging to be turned into wallpapers, but instead it's all about the refined details. At first glance, from gameplay videos and screenshots, I honestly wasn't sold. I saw people saying it looked great, but remember thinking, does it really? It doesn't really look all that special. But once I actually stepped into the zone, I realised what they meant. The level of detail is really good. It's not like in a flashy, obvious way, but in the subtleties. There are no glaringly low-poly models or rough edges that break immersion. Everything feels cohesive and deliberate, which makes the world feel alive and authentic, well, visually at least. Gunplay in Stalker 2 is, for the most part, solid and satisfying. While I know some people have issues with it, and I can see where they're coming from, I'm glad it doesn't try to mimic something like Call of Duty or CSGO. It's functional, responsive, and does exactly what it needs to for the game to succeed. Firing weapons feels satisfying, and there's a great attention to detail, like guns jamming when their durability is low, which can really screw you up if you're not careful. Another nice touch is how guns hold an extra bullet beyond the magazine capacity, which is the round in the chamber. Though I was a bit surprised they didn't take it a step further by making reloading waste unused bullets, like in Helldivers. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded that. So that said, the main frustrations with combat tend to come from the NPCs and mutants rather than the mechanics themselves. Like, enemies are often a bit too accurate and always seem to spot you first, which can feel a bit unfair at times. There's also an imbalance with enemy health that holds the experience back slightly, though the devs are actively working on improving this, and they have a little bit since release at least. Still, some aspects of combat can get particularly frustrating, especially when dealing with certain mutants. A prime example of this is how some of them constantly knock you over during fights. This wouldn't be so much of an issue if there was mechanics like dodging or some other way to avoid it, but without those options, it just feels annoying and unfair. It's especially aggravating when you're up against multiple mutants that can essentially stun lock you with repeated knockdowns. At times, it feels like the game approaches mutant encounters as though it were a fantasy RPG where mechanics like dodging, blocking, and strategic positioning are integral to avoiding damage and status effects, beyond just taking damage as is the standard for shooters. But in an FPS without those systems, sometimes these fights can just feel kind of clunky and not entirely thought out within their context. And to be clear, I am not saying the game needs a dodge or block system. The issue is that the design philosophy behind these encounters creates situations that don't feel like a test of skill, they're just annoying. For instance, there's one mutant that stomps the ground to knock you over, and while you might think, oh, I can just jump to avoid that, no, even if you jump, you still get knocked straight out of the air. And systems like this are frustrating because there's no meaningful way to react or avoid being stuck in a long knockdown animation while still taking hits. Like, it's not challenging, it's just irritating. And because of this, there are several mutants that I always loathe to have to fight, and not because of a challenge, I do like the challenge of a dangerous enemy, but rather because fighting them didn't feel like a test of skill, it was just annoying and frustrating. There's also no mutant loot after you go through all this trouble either, which I don't necessarily mind, but it also makes some fights feel like a bit of a waste of time when they're not fun or rewarding. Still, despite these flaws, the combat still remains engaging, and my gripes don't ruin the experience. The story and dialogue in Stalker 2 is a bit of a mixed bag. The first third-ish of the story is kind of, well, just bad, to be honest. It's boring and does a terrible job of explaining what's happening and why. And worst of all, completely fails to hook you into caring about the protagonist's problems. For a good chunk of the game, Skiff's, that's the protagonist, primary motivation is essentially, I lost my house, so I'm mad and need money. And that's basically it. And while Skiff himself is well voice acted and shows some personality in his performance, it's hard to connect with the context of his struggles. Like, okay, you lost your apartment, but unless that place held some deep emotional significance or someone important was buried underneath the rubble, I just don't care, mate. That said, the story does improve significantly later on. It starts introducing moral dilemmas and some thought-provoking questions that the beginning sorely lacks. There are also several meaningful game-changing decisions to make along the way, which add a nice dynamic and weight to your actions. As for the dialogue, it's a bit of a roller coaster. Sometimes it's superb, and other times it's good but unremarkable, and occasionally it veers into meh territory. Every now and then, a character will launch into a vague spiel, and you're left wondering, what the hell are you going on about? How does this even relate to what's happening? And a lot of the meaningful dialogue has this tendency to take straightforward ideas and express them in long-winded, almost poetic or romanticized way. And while that can be intriguing at times, it's also easy to get lost in if you're not fully prepared for it and paying close attention. Still, the stronger moments of dialogue and narrative leave a more lasting impression, which helps redeem the weaker parts. I just really wish the opening section did a better job of hooking you in and giving Skiff's character and motivation some much needed depth. Now, before getting into some of my bigger problems, if you're enjoying this review so far, I'd really appreciate you slapping the like button and subscribing. It really helps me out, and I know you hear subscribers say that a lot, and that's because your fingers and eyes really are the difference between success and failure on here. And if you like this, I'll be doing more in-depth reviews like this in the future, as I'm excited to review a lot of 2025's upcoming titles. Plus, feel free to drop a comment with your thoughts on Stalker 2. I know not all of you will agree with some of my points here, so let me know why. Anyway, with that said, let's dive into some of the game's bigger issues. And these mainly fall into two categories. The incomplete, which is bugs, unimplemented features, and general performance. And then there's features or functionalities that could have been executed better. On the performance side, there are still frequent FPS drops in certain areas, freezes, crashes, and some other issues. And while the performance has certainly improved since release, it's still far from perfect. Although it can be drastically improved with a bit of effort. By tweaking settings and using some lightweight mods, I managed to achieve a fairly constant 90 to 100 FPS at 1440p with medium-high settings on my 3070. Even so, you shouldn't have to rely on mods to get a smooth experience, and some areas, like NPC settlements, still cause noticeable dips in performance, making them less than pleasant places to linger. But overall, it's not too bad, and it's definitely manageable if you're willing to fiddle with it. As for bugs and missing features, they're the big problems I feel. At the beginning, it wasn't uncommon for broken quests to softlock progress entirely. However, they've fixed a ton of these, so I think it's pretty safe on that front now. Other issues include audio playing incorrectly, NPCs awkwardly standing inside each other, and various other UI and functionality glitches. That said, aside from the quest bugs, none of these are game-breaking, and it sounds a lot worse than it is. They're more annoying than truly frustrating, and while they still need to be addressed, it has gotten significantly better since launch, and for me at least, is far from unplayable. Also, at launch, Stalker 2's A-Life, which acts like an AI dungeon master controlling the world by spawning enemies and populating the environment in real time, it wasn't fully integrated. However, in recent updates, A-Life has improved substantially. I'm not sure if it's reached its full potential yet, but it's definitely much better than it was at launch. So, yeah, Stalker 2 is not completely polished, but I think it's complete enough to be an enjoyable experience if you can overlook the minor things here and there. But personally, some of my biggest current gripes with the game don't stem from bugs, performance, or these incomplete features. It's that the game sometimes feels imbalanced and disingenuous to the experience its setting and atmosphere implies it to be. These are areas that are heavily based on personal preference and expectations of the game, so some will agree, and that's fine. This is just how I feel about it. So, what do I mean by all this? Okay, first is the sleep and hunger systems. In a survival game like this, these mechanics should create tension and force you to plan ahead, but here they just don't. Food is so abundant that starving isn't even on the table, and if it's a mechanic that you don't have to consciously manage, then what's really the point of it besides an animation, which can eventually just get a bit annoying? Meanwhile, energy drinks make sleep irrelevant. You can chug one a day and become a caffeine-fueled insomniac forever. Survival mechanics like these should feel impactful and integral to the experience, but they just don't. Then there's the difficulty balance. I played on Veteran expecting a challenging tactical experience where every fight felt like life or death, but instead it kind of just makes the enemies unrealistic bullet sponges and the economy unreasonably harsh. In Stalker 2, I just feel like a harder difficulty should mean smarter exploring and smarter fights, not just longer ones. And lastly, there's the exploration and mutant AI. For a game that's built around suspense, a lot of the buildings are empty, and when mutants or enemies do show up, they're not exactly subtle. You can hear them coming a mile away, and it kills any sense of dread or surprise. And worse still, most mutants can't handle a waist-high box. With a bit of elevation, all suspense and the threat of most common mutants are gone. To its credit though, there are exceptions, like Snorks. They're relentless, they can jump up to you and they'll still ruin your day. But the rest of the mutant roster just feels a bit underwhelming sometimes, which really takes the edge off exploring. So those are my main criticisms for the game, and they definitely don't ruin it for me, but just adjusting them would make Stalker 2 go from great to unforgettable, for me at least. I went into a lot more detail about them here in another video, so I recommend checking that out if you want a deeper dive into my thoughts on how the game could be adjusted to turn these weaknesses into strengths. There are also a few other little janky things that I'd love to see adjusted. For example, enemies take way too long to retaliate after dialogue, in a Skyrim kind of like way where they just casually draw their weapons after a cutscene, which is a level of jank I kind of expect shouldn't be as prevalent in this era of gaming. Similarly, some animations just feel a bit clunky, with that wait for the last animation to finish before the next one begins kind of jank. Not a big deal, but it just feels like we should be able to expect more fluent animations by this time. Now that we've covered the main points, there's something else worth mentioning that I might not typically focus on in a review, and that's the modding scene for Stalker 2. Again, I never played any of the old Stalker games or their mods, but I know they became a huge part of the series' identity, extending its lifespan far beyond what it would have otherwise been. And I can definitely see that happening with Stalker 2. While the mods available right now don't make any drastic changes to the game, mostly focusing on tweaking features, adjusting values, or adding lightweight alterations, the game feels like a perfect springboard for modders. Because of this, I can easily see myself returning to Stalker 2 in the future, knowing that the experience will be vastly different, partially due to updates, but mainly because the modding community will likely shape it into something players can truly customize. Whether that's an intense, hardcore survival experience, a gunslinging zombie horde massacre, or whatever the hell this is, I'm sure the mods will make it possible. And that's what excites me about the future of this game, and whether you play it now or not, I'd recommend checking back in after a while to see what the modders have cooked up. So, ultimately, Stalker 2 is a fantastic game, but it's also a bit of a rough diamond. It's clear that the developers at GSC Game World have a vision for the series, and while there are still some bugs, performance issues, and design quirks, I can't help but feel that this is a game with great potential. And with the ongoing updates and a thriving modding community, there's a good chance this game will only improve with time. If you're into immersive survival shooters and are willing to overlook a few bumps on the road, Stalker 2 is definitely worth your time. But if you're expecting a smooth, polished experience right out of the gate, you might want to wait a little bit before diving in. Although, from what I understand of the franchise's history, a little bit of jank might just be in its DNA. Or otherwise, in the future, it might just be worth checking out for the modding scene. Well, if you made it this far, again, I'd really appreciate a like if you enjoyed this. And if you want a deeper dive into more specific aspects of the game, check out my other videos where I break down what could make this game even better and the mods I personally used. And subscribe for more content and updates on how Stalker 2 is evolving and videos on new upcoming games. So, thanks for watching and catch ya.